There's so many different interesting planets out there, and there is a world called Zalero 2, which actually is a planet filled with oceans all over, very shallow seas in which life begins and sets off on their different adventures, forking off into different species and niches. It has a huge supercontinent, and these shallow seas are pocketed throughout the continent. The local plants are light blue sponges. Clan of crimson pentapods constantly vie for territory. The local sponges also periodically set themselves on fire to spread their seeds. One specific sea we're going to be taking a look at is Anthon. The Anthon Sea is filled with microscopic life, and now is the time of this planet's life because complex life is just beginning. In the Sea of Anthon, in a particular reef, there's a particular animal known as a boatner. This multicellular animal wiggles throughout the very dark depths of the sea looking for something to eat. The creature has eye spots on the top of its body, which is photosensitive, and it uses to detect movement. It has two little appendages on the front that it utilizes for grabbing, passing prey, and other organisms. It has a small mouth part to ingest food. It has a foldable appendage that it uses to propel itself forward. Very tiny cilia, which are very tiny hairs, are layered all throughout the upper part of its body that also help to propel it. The boatner at this stage spends most of its life propelling through the water and feeding on these very microscopic creatures. And what a difference 100,000 years can make for a tiny creature like this. Somewhere across the Anthon Sea, a little bit closer to the shores, there's a very steep drop-off right at the edge of the coral reef area that leads into the shallow water. And it's within the depths of the sea that the boatner organism's descendants live. The boatner had started traveling to the surface after many, many generations, and eventually would hang among the reefs and ambush their prey. This is the Gascala. Over time, it has evolved with eyes facing forward and more developed eyes since it hung closer to the surface of the waters and chose to hunt during the day, where the sun would kind of break through the water. And on this planet, the water is just very clear. It's still water, but there's an element to it that makes it a lot easier to see through than the waters we have here on Earth. And as a result of this creature keeping buoyant and staying somewhere right under the surface of the water, closer to the surface of the water, these tall reeds or underwater weeds would grow up and touch the surface. And because of that, there were these little wormy fish-like organisms that would feed on them. And this thing would use those very flat apparatuses on the sides of its body to capture its prey. Its little stick legs had formed into these flipper-like body parts that just hung below them. They would kick paddle every now and then to propel the animal upwards. Contrary to what it may seem like though, the Gascala's little apparatuses were just made of tissue and a very small tendon. Not only would they catch the prey, they would keep slamming the prey against its body until the prey was knocked out or killed. Then the Gascala would back up, utilizing these tissue flaps, and devour the prey. It was a very easy way of catching prey with very little effort. Eventually, as the prey got larger, the Gascala hung out more on the surface, and in 10,000 years, the Gascala creatures got larger as well. They still looked like fish, but their flaps were smaller, and instead, they opted for using their little beaks to catch prey straight from out of the water. Because of their larger eyes, hanging out on the surface with the sun kind of penetrating the water so they could see everything clearly, they could see the little specks in the water very well. And they would even hang out on the surface with half their body submerged, looking like little goldfish, so that they could feed on the healthiest of these little shrimp-like, worm-like organisms. The fatter ones got the most sun and they stayed on the top, and that's exactly where the Gascala hung out. In another 30,000 years, the Gascala creatures started to change. Those little stick legs that they had at the beginning didn't really have much use, but now hanging out near the surface, the Gascala started doing something differently over time. They would go towards the shore, and there was like a little embankment on the shore. So instead of having a gradual sloping beach, you would have sort of rock steps that led you into the shallow water and eventually to the shore. And the Gascala would use their little tiny flipper-like appendages that are hanging underneath their bodies to hang onto these rocks. Their fish-like tail that didn't have the flukes on the end of it would be used to keep themselves propelling forward. And over time, they lost those flaps on the tops of their bodies because they didn't need them. In 600,000 years, not only were there a lot of land changes, but there were also a lot of marine and aquatic changes as well. Creatures were changing as more vegetation became available by the shore. As the little tiny creatures that the Gascala would prey on became adapted to life outside of the water, they would stay in the wet areas on the shore. You see, the reason why they had to make this adaptation is because the Gascala were feeding on all the ones that were in the water and the shallow end. So what would happen is the ones that did survive out by the shore were the ones that were breeding, the ones that were more adaptable and able to survive in the shallowest of water, which is water just mixed in with sediment. So over the evolutionary chain, you would see the Gascala basically evolving and following the trail of their prey. So after that amount of time, Gascala had developed the ability to walk on the shore. They were still pretty small, roughly about the size of your house key, but there was a problem. As these creatures came upon shore, there were other creatures that would feed on them. Tiny creatures with many appendages behind them that resemble sort of goldfish or axolotls with about 3 dozen little tiny tail fins behind what looked like a floating head would have learned to utilize these fins as sort of arms to drag themselves across the slippery surfaces of the sediment on the shore. As a result, they would pick off the descendants of the Gascala. In this evolutionary stage, the Gascala and Botner's descendants were called Mooshings. As it got too hot and the suns would rise in the sky, the Mooshings would make their way back to the sea, but not all the way out to sea. They always hung right by the shore, so right underneath the embankment in the crevice of a rock where they would build their home. It would be well over 50 million years before we came back to this planet to see what happened to the descendants of the Botner. Millions of years since the Botner came onto the scene, it had gone through many changes. But this next evolution had to be the most drastic change. The small feet of a rat-sized critter gleefully hopped to and fro while collecting the riches from the moist leafy floors of the UNYO forest. The creature is called a Capythorax, a play on the Latin words caput parvum thorax, which means small head jumper. This rat-sized creature is in fact a descendant of the Botner, the Gascala, and the Mooshing. This one is a male. Even though this creature seems to spend most of its time on land, it still tends to hang out in the area by the lakes and streams. This young male hangs out near a stream, and because they occasionally go into the water to hide from predators, the little forelegs or arms that were on the front side of the body have since been pushed back and are no longer hanging down, but pushed back onto the body and used as modified flippers. It may look like feathers looking onto the creature, as it does have a very bird-like appearance, especially when you consider its 2 long bird-like legs, with the exception of the toe ending in 1 sharp claw instead of 3 or 4. This tail that looks like feathers is actually a long flat-like fin that the creature can use to quickly propel itself and dive into the water if it needs to get away. The huge chest muscles that have developed here are attached to the limbs that are hidden under the creature's flaps. When the creature jumps into the water, those flaps raise outward like 2 fish fins and propel them further forward. The very small head on the creature is very streamlined with a tiny neck, which is good at swiveling very well so that the creature can quickly turn directions. As it is swimming, its legs tuck in, almost like a bird's legs when they're flying, so that the creature can move more efficiently and aerodynamically in the water. The creature has a very small spotted eye and has decent vision. The markings on its face are actually there to make the creature blend in. It's partially camouflage, its eye being in the middle right there, so that at times it can appear larger than it is, or it can blend in if it can't get to the water fast enough. It can blend in, flattening itself to the ground to look like part of the detritus. That's also why they evolved to have flat tails. So when this creature is sitting flat against the surface of this background or the forest floor, it looks like one of the dead leaves. Now, the females of the species are almost completely brown and invisible, especially when they're camouflaging in with the forest floor. But the males have developed a very interesting way of making their beautiful fins that they do use in courtship and mating to still be hidden whenever there is danger around and they can't get to the water. The flaps on their either side of their body will actually go up above the tail, and the tail will turn around and show the beige underneath. This creature knows exactly what's up. The very top of its head has a green palette which fits in very perfectly with the forest floor. This planet has leaves as well and trees, but they look drastically different than what we have on our planet. The plants and flora of this environment are packed with nutrition. There is so much life just underneath the forest floor and in the stream itself. Capythorax usually take advantage of this by hunting both close to the shores of the streams as well as in the streams. This young male is an experienced hunter, and those heavy chest muscles are also a fantastic adaptation to help him propel himself upstream. He can go as fast upstream as he can downstream because of the power of those muscles and his tail. The male isn't just prowling around this area for no reason. He spotted a female. This female is a bit brighter than most females, and she's in the middle of catching a wispy thin creature that uses rotating petals on the top of its head to fly. The creature has a thicker frontal with a tiny head at the tip and the propelling petals at the top. It has a long tail that forks into two at the end. These things may look like easy prey, but you really need to be experienced when catching them, because that little forked tail can deliver such a whip that it can actually break the neck of these creatures. The male approaches the female. She is older than him, and so she's way more experienced. She's also larger. As the male approaches her, he dives into the stream and showcases his power by quickly swimming up the stream. The female, however, is not watching. She is not interested. There's another male she has her eye on, and she's been tailing him for a few days now. Unfortunately, our little male does not get the picture. Capythorax can be very convincing, but there's no luck for this boy. As he gets closer to the female, she holds her two pectoral fins, her flaps out to the side to make herself appear bigger, and raise up her tail in a quite masculine display of aggression. With the young male being so inexperienced, he definitely takes this as a threat and leaves, whereas an older or more experienced male would know exactly what this is. This is the chance that he would need to take, so the female would take him seriously, and he would have to display back, showing that he is strong. Stronger than her, so he's able to take care of her. But the little male goes running in the other direction. Fail the test. The female cocks her head to the side after picking back up her prey, continues trailing the male that she was going after anyway. But don't feel too bad, because after a while, and as he gets older, this young male Capythorax would successfully mate with many females. After 200 million years, the terrain and weather of the planet Ziliro has changed. Tornadoes are now a common occurrence in the UNYO forest and its adjacent plains. The environment has also become a hostile one, but even still, this does not stop creatures and plants from evolving. The UNYO forest is still home to a variety of plant and animal species that have adapted to withstand the magnificent cyclones that constantly rip the landscape apart. In general, trees have evolved significantly thicker and deeper roots. They adapted, and now their trunks are considerably more flexible, allowing them to endure the violent gales. Still yet at the base of one of these trees, a little creature takes cover. It emits a trilling sound and moves its head back and forth, assessing if the threat has at least temporarily passed. This small creature, which is roughly the size of a standard 10-pound chihuahua, is called the Magnathorax, a descendant of our Capythorax. Immediately, the developments since the last evolution are very evident. Over time, the creature has evolved to have a larger head, a larger body mass, a longer tail, and somewhat shorter legs, with an extra toe and webbing in between the two toes. This creature has a bright green color, and it may seem as though this little creature that is now covered in what seems like fish scales would not be ideal for its environment. In reality, trees in this ecosystem are constantly shedding their unique leaves. On this planet, most of the species of trees house their seeds inside their leaves, and so when the leaves fall or are shaken off violently by an event such as these common tornadoes, these seeds go along for the ride, and that's how they're able to spread out. Many of these extremely green leaves would float in the air for some time before falling to the forest floor, and this is where our Magnathorax's camouflage and body plan come into play. Since it spends more of its time on land and less time fighting the upstream current in the water, its chest muscles have diminished, and its general build is considerably more robust than that of its ancestors. Its head is much larger, as you can see here, and its neck much shorter. It is perfectly adapted to look like a piece of its environment, to look like a leaf. If you were to pick up the creature, it would weigh surprisingly only 3 pounds, and its tail would wrap around your hand, keep it so steady, and that's because this creature not only spends its time time on the forest floor when the leaves had fallen, it spends its time in the trees. Although they are difficult to see, the creature still has flaps on its side that it keeps out of the way as it goes about its business. It employs its enormous mouth and extremely strong jaws to help hold on to the base of trees and pull itself upwards using its jaws as a sort of hand. So like a lizard biting a tree bark, this creature uses reptilian jaws and sharp teeth to sink into the flesh of the surface of the plant or tree it's trying to climb, aided by the two sharp claws on each foot and its muscular thigh muscles, as well as its prehensile tail. Since the tornadoes in the area seem to occur less at nighttime due to the temperatures being more stable, the Magnathorax has evolved to be a nocturnal hunter. Not only is it an accomplished scavenger, but it can also travel very quietly on the forest floor or through the trees in order to pursue its prey. When food is scarce and when it's available, finally, the Magnathorax will explore the water, but it is evident that the genetic line will be Landfares. After 150 million more years, the Magnathorax has changed completely. The once small creature the size of a chihuahua has now evolved into two separate species, but cut from the same cloth. A species the size of a shoe that resembles an iguana. This is the lesser known version of the species, but it is this member that we'll be focusing on. The UNYO forest has gone through many changes as well. A lot of the trees have adapted to simply opening up their leaves and dropping the seeds on the ground. Tornadoes are not as common as they used to be in this area, and the climate has changed as it is always changing. On the forest floor, though, under the cover of a dark canopy, is the descendant of the Magnathorax. She is a green mottled finch. Evolution has so many ways of giving rise to many new species. There are actually many different kinds of finch. These creatures have since spread out to different parts of the forest and even into different biomes. Her species, or more correctly termed breed, has a lesser known version. But after a while, these guys, since they can be bred with this version of the species, they are known as the lesser known ones because they eventually die out or are merged in with her breed. So as I said, these creatures have been spread out into many parts of the forest, and it was inevitable. When the tornadoes were tearing through the landscape on the regular 150 million years ago, the tree leaves with their seeds nestled inside them were not the only things that were quickly swept up them from the forest floor and then taken across many kilometers. Many different species were violently swept up by the tornadoes, and if they weren't killed, they were dropped down in a completely different environment than the ones where they had made their home. Quite a few of the Magnathorax, along with other species, had to quickly adapt to a completely different ecosystem. So a cousin of the finch, also descended from the Magnathorax, lives in more open fields and under rocks. This is the bumpy back finch, and it's a hardier version of our green finch. And because of its anatomy, it actually resembles a toad more than a small scaly lizard. This creature mostly feeds on large insects and very small creatures. But our green mottled finch has the makings of a predator. She will go after stuff her size or bigger if she can get away with it. Still holding on to the prehensile tail from earlier, she has the two smaller legs in the front, as does the lesser known version. She can actually wrap herself around her prey to restrict them so she can attack them. 100 more million years, and the green mottled finch has shrunken again in size. This kitten-sized creature called the Lupow has once again taken to the trees. It has small little hands at the base of its neck that it uses for climbing, and a slightly longer body with a prehensile tail as well, similar to that of a chameleon, that it uses to navigate the trees and the underbrush. Blending in seamlessly with its environment, it is hard for predators to notice it. If it does get noticed and something happens to take a bite out of it and it happens to scratch or bite them, they're going to have some very nasty side effects. Constantly drooling until whoever is unfortunate to have a run-in with the Lupow becomes dehydrated. The more they would try to drink water, the more they would experience this drowning sensation that would completely disable them. And after a while, after the delirium hits, they would eventually die. If they do happen to survive and defy all odds, then they would stay very far away from the Lupow. In 60 million years, the Lupow would evolve into the nip trekker. This creature's diet would consist of 80% flowers and vegetation, since that's where it would spend most of its time. The nip trekker had a very distinct jaw. Its bottom jaw would be lined with this calcified mechanism that looks like like teeth, but acted as a beak. It was completely at home, crushing nuts, chewing off tree bark to get to anything it needed to get to. This was at a high time in the area, and now we are skirting to the outer portions of the UNYO forest, where 45 million years later, the niptrekker would evolve into the buckleaf trekker. Both these creatures are so small they could fit into the palm of your hand. Around this time, the area had become a lot more hostile. Temperatures were rising and dropping all the time. Species were dying off, and as a result, there was less food to go around. Creatures had to get very wily, and they also had to conserve the little bit of energy they had left. With these smaller creatures, they didn't have to worry about eating so much. The buckleaf trekker would have pieces of flappy tissue all over its skin to help it better blend into its environment with this very short shrubs on the ground. It was also a way to quickly regulate its temperature. Say if the temperature was to go from 200 degrees in the next half hour all the way down to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The buckleaf trekker was surprisingly successful, and because it spent most of its time underneath a canopy, its vision was all but gone. 111 million years later, the buckleaf trekker's descendant, the Shortnose Lilops, would venture back into the sunlight. It spent most of its time on rocks near vegetation and shores, just like its ancestors, the Capy thorax. This is an opportunist. This little four-legged creature with a long reptilian tail that was honestly more fish-like with little flukes at the end of it would spend its time quickly shifting through the dirt and sediment to find worms, larvae, anything that it could get its mouth on. They were also preyed upon heavily. So the strongest of these survived. And honestly, for the short-nosed lilops and all these families of lilops, the best thing that could have ever happened to them was a predator hunting them. It all comes back around full circle because remember these little microscopic organisms that their ancestor, the boatner, used to feed on? They eventually evolved into this. Creatures that were as large as a 10-foot trampoline that looked like jellyfish. However, the haunting part about them is that they can live outside the water for a whole hour. You would never see them coming because even though they're bioluminescent and that's how they communicate with each other, they're also surprisingly intelligent for the type of creature that they are. When they're on land, they are clear. So you wouldn't know that you're right by one. You would be by a river shore or stream bed and you would just be walking along and everything is slippery and everything is wet, and so this thing blends right in. This creature is a river star. They have potent, deadly venom. The minute you step into them, these spines automatically shoot up. It's just a reaction, kind of like a booby trap, and they pierce anyone's foot or anything that isn't made of metal or rock and quickly infect you with all those little barbs. As soon as you feel it, you would go tumbling head over heel because you would no longer have the ability to balance and stand upright. Alternatively, these creatures, it would be a defense mechanism also to catch creatures, but they would do some hunting of their own, where they would use their wiry tentacles, blend in with their environment by being clear, and silently stalk a creature that was heading in their direction. And they were smart. They understood movement. They understood when something was coming towards them. So if something was coming towards them, it's kind of like 1, 2, 3 red light. They would kind of stay still and blend in. If they sensed that it was moving backwards from them, then they would silently kind of ebb themselves over the slippery rocks. Honestly, it was very haunting because the way they made themselves look, they flattened themselves out. So you don't just see a big glop of jelly just sitting there. It's spread out about 10 feet. And if you were to go and take a drone and look from the top down, maybe you could see the edges of it, but it would be indiscernible. And so every time there would be water or the creature that they're stalking moves in the opposite direction, they would literally emulate the water and slip and slide like a jelly sheet over the slippery rocks near the bank until they catch the creature. They also have little barbs on the ends of their tentacles. And so even if whatever the creature is they catch manages to bite through them, not only can they grow those tentacles back, the creature is dead anyway. You know the rules, don't let it touch you. And because all the short-nosed lilops were specifically preyed upon, since they hunted near the shores also by the river stars, only the strongest and smartest would survive. 600,000 years later, they would build up a thicker hide to combat the barbs of the river star. 5 million years later, they would evolve from the thick-hided, stub-nosed lilops into the broadback velvet lilops, a creature that spent most of its time in trees. And because most of them, or its kind, that were preyed on by these river stars were having an issue, the ones that survived mostly were the ones that stayed away from the river shore and all those other predators. They stayed up in the trees and they pretended to be part of the tree and would strike out using their tail to catch whatever they needed and to bring it into their mouth. So here's the creature's eyes and its head and its mouth, it had the short arms, a little thigh here. It's called the broadback because it has these tissue flaps that would come out and act as kind of substrate to keep itself from falling. Then it would have this very long back that extended past its feet and a long tail that curled around and then acted like a sort of twig or a part of the tree that it was attached to. This tail would be the thing that would eat them, so the less movement they did is the more hidden they were from predators. There are some species of these trees on this planet that would change color, and when that happens, the broadback velvet would also change its color. 17 million years later, giant Usoto would be a big improvement and a bit larger than its predecessor. Where the broadback velvet was the size of a small Pomeranian, the giant Usoto was the size of a beagle, but much longer. The creature kept some of the features of its bright eyes, it hunted mostly in the daytime, and it had its jaws that were almost seamless because it would also blend in with its environment. The scales also modified to look more like leaves, and the front legs of the creature would evolve to look more like the twigs that they would be attached to. So you would have branches that would be one color, and then they would have a gradient transitioned into the green leaves. While the creature spent most of its time in the trees, it wanted to look as believable as possible. So its legs would also look like twigs, and so if you're looking at it from a distance, you would think this is a twig ending in a leaf like the rest of the tree. The giant Usoto was very popular and a very successful species. And what made it so successful is not just the fact that it was great with camouflage, but living in the trees, it was able to cycle through like a large skink with very short legs and a long body. It was able to eat creatures that would make their home in the trees and have their babies in the trees. It ate so many eggs that after a while the species became successful and much larger. As I said, the land is changing always, and this is around the time where the land has become more fruitful. It is still a hostile environment, but life in the trees fared to be more nutritious and less painstaking. But that would change 120 million years later. After 120 million years, climate has done its damage, or as we should say, done its work in reshaping the land. This area used to be the UNYO forest. It is very inhospitable. What used to be fresh running water here is now covered in brackish water. The area is always flooding and there are constant landslides. And most times out of the year, this area is completely dry, completely devoid of water. A lot of creatures don't make it here, but one creature is hardy enough to be the king of this area. It is now known as the UNYO Badlands. The creature that rules supreme is the Red Eard Arosa, the descendant of the giant Usoto, the descendant of the Magnathorax. Even in this inhospitable land, the Red Eard Arosa, a creature the size of a very small crocodile or a Komodo dragon, uses its 4 legs to navigate the area. It can gallop quickly if it needs to. 2 males of the species stand off against each other. Their jaws actually open very wide, wider than they look, and like hamsters or pelicans, they can hold food in their mouths. There's a flappy, loose part on their skin from the inside of their throat which distends considerably, like a full stomach. They use this to store food. The creature comes out mostly in the daytime because it can withstand the heat, which gets up to 130 degrees. Those obsolete flaps that the Red Eard Arosa's ancestors used to have comes into handy now on the side of its neck. Almost like a cobra, these flaps extend in order to dissipate heat and to soak it up if need be. This creature is the hunting machine of its era. As the land continues to change, the fight for food is real, and as these 2 males stand off against each other, both of their mouths open really wide. They start whipping each other with their very long tails, snapping at each other, and ultimately break out into a brawl. They always aim for each other's flaps. Their flaps are very valuable, very important to their way of living. If a Red Eard Arosa ever lost its flaps, it would be able to regenerate them, but they would never be at their full form as they once were. Every time they regenerate, they would get smaller and thicker, and so the use that they used to have when they were thinner and no injury was done to them, they're not going to have that same level as value. So those Arosas, if they continue getting into fights and getting their flaps injured, would eventually die. It is important in this hostile environment for the Red Eard Arosa to be able to regulate their temperature. Many creatures don't do that. So at the hottest parts of this region, of the month or the year of this region, most of the species would leave, but the Red Eard Arosa would stay. And they got so successful at this because when all the other animals that would prey would follow most of the prey out of the region, there were still creatures left back that highly adapted to this hostile environment, the same as the Red Eard Arosa. And so the Red Eard Arosa would have a smorgasbord of creatures that were all like, oh, now we can freely go and do what we need to do. The only predator that was left in the area around these times was the Red Eard Arosa. But they weren't keen on sharing with each other. That is also because when the males find a female, they're going to want the female to have their babies. Red Eard Arosa do lay eggs, and when those babies hatch, they're going to be hungry. They can't have a big male eating up all the food. And so this male, standing off against an older male, brings the fight to a close after he rips off one of the flaps off the side of his neck. He does a roaring, chirping sound very valiantly, stands on the creature's head. The older Arosa shakes his head free and hisses and then leaves very slowly. The Red Eard Arosa would go on to being a very successful species. And it takes a very successful species to live on such a hostile but beautiful planet, Zoology.